smallpox. But they traced to a guy who came up from Mexico on the train.
Yeah.
He was headed to New England, up further north, but he didn't feel well, so he got off in New York City. Took himself to a hotel, and it started an epidemic. But by that time, they had the vaccine, so they did vaccination. I mean, it was done very military style.
Now, what year was it?
After the I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a big deal where it is.
I can imagine
You probably don't even. Did you get smallpox vaccine? I don't think you would know because it was a scar. And I have it, but that chickenpox is really scarring.
I had chickenpox.
My mother, another family was like measles or mumps or chickenpox. She was trying to get exposed to everything. So she was going to visit the members because their son has the mumps.
There's one way to do it. People back then were tougher though. There was this understanding that not everybody survived.
True.
There just was.
Yeah. And my mother would describe this.
You know, and I read like stories from the 19th century, you know, like 1 out of every 3 or 4 babies didn't make it a lot of times. Yeah.
My grandmother is the oldest too, like a cheese. She told stories about they believe that one of the sisters in a child struggle, and the child was 2 years old. And maybe she had influenza, so she felt it's they had a belief that child struggle. And I read the book about Gloria
Times
all the things
change.
they did
I was giving you the same
are
thing.
things that we would consider torture.
Well,
And that was what
Right. And they didn't know. Everybody was just guessing.
and that's pretty much what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't know, try everything.
And that's fine. But what do you do?
Yeah. Choose your poison.
Pretty much. You know?
My husband Steve was, when I thought of me, I was not getting a cancer.
I remember as a kid watching cartoons of that happening. I remember asking her out.
They were on Facebook. Somebody posted a picture. Finally, crazy. You were out. You ever read that red stuff? And sometimes it was I.
The 13th, I turned 19. Shoot.
The red ones that you'd rather go have your arm.
Yeah, for sure.
No doubt.
Imagine that. Sometimes we're just like, oh. Yeah, it almost could happen. I know where you're shot. Are you getting bombarded by Coldwater Creek? No.
It was not on purpose.
Razor Road.
Yep.
No, I think so. They're back.
I hope you want to read that word. That's it. Thank you. This girl's road is.
You want me to know they're back? I tried to keep you. I'm not helping.
Yeah, about, I got up and started using my razor and then just suddenly quit.
I didn't get mine out.
How much did you get done? I've always thought that mine, part time goes dead, I forget to charge it. And I said, what would we do if we got halfway around?
Yeah, I got some stuff.
I got what I could, and then I had a manual razor that was old. I tried to kind of scratch away what I could. That's gonna live with it now. So. It's not on purpose. I'm not a facial hair kind of guy. It is what it is today.
Maybe it's because of the size you are.
Morning.
Hey,
How are you?
See,
I haven't fell down yet. It's not bad. It really is. It's not sleep like I feel. I put my sweats on. I don't need it.
Yeah. Don't assume.
Yeah.
For sure. Good deal. Yeah, I have to admit, when I couldn't finish this morning before I got here, I thought, now I have to not think about it because I don't like it. I don't like the way it feels. I'm not a facial hair person, so it's gonna bother me until I can get home. Hey, this isn't on purpose.
I'm not a fan of facial hair.
Right.
As well.
I
have all
Yeah. I'm not a, yeah.
Stray eyebrows are crazy.
Yeah. So I'm gonna have to figure that out later today.
Is that just 1 week?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I grew up more than I used to. When I was in my 20s, early 30s, I could go weeks without shaving. And now it's like wanting to come out of it. It's like going through puberty at 40. Yeah, pretty much.
We joke about how as we get older, men have less hair, but it goes into other places. I read an article said, I always call them whiskers. I always call them stray eyebrows no matter where they come.
That's a good idea. Yeah. And I've seen some undergo hair, and I think that's just not a good one. It's not. You don't have to hide mustache. You know, of course, don't say anything, but you can't help it.
We all see it, we all see it.
I have a friend who's good lady. She didn't care all of her. I never met him. I was there. And she was very good. I always had myself together. I never not say my own. Yeah. You know, I was attracted to it. Right.
You're from good work.
Right. I was about one of the reasons why Steve sometimes struggled with talking. You know, it was so easy to snare. He had his way. And nobody could look at himself. It was just, you don't want to like see him. I understood that. No, man. No, sorry. So it was hard. I don't think he realized it was hard on me. I didn't want to say that way. I wanted to see Steve. I never got to see Steve strong.
Yeah.
You know?
No.
Yeah, I understand.
Hey, Rosalie. Hi. Everything all right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's the same, you know, it's the same. Then
Oh, yeah. My mind is elsewhere. Yeah, we got it covered.
It's weird. Cold outside. It's a lot more than that's weird.
Right, yeah.
Slick your way.
Just like,
State highway.
It was not on purpose.
yeah.
No, it's just now, so that we can put the new kitchen cabinet, something's down, constantly down the wall, yeah, place it, and then that's where, yeah, water heater. Yep, so that was our Christmas But I had to finish
I haven't tripped this off. I figured I'd go for sharks in a month.
They're not seeing you.
And,
Going, Ben? Alright, enjoyed Christmas? Get anything fun? Huh? Get anything fun? Right, yeah. A good bag is worth everything. All right, well, good morning, everybody. Kind of want to start to get started, you might say. We are a few minutes after 9. I don't think anybody can see what's going on here. Okay, there we go, a little better. All right. I've got a note here from Wayne I'm going to read. And yeah, we'll read both. Yeah. But this is from Wayne. You said your granddaughters wrote it, is that right?
No, my daughter and daughter-in-law.
Daughter and daughter.
They helped me out. I'm not the best writer. I would have said something, but I might write down, so I just do it this way.
I understand. To the church family, thanks for the prayers for Elizabeth while in the ICU. Also, thanks for the good meal after the services from the family of Elizabeth Beeson. Your kindness and concern has meant so very much and will always be remembered. So, thank you. All right, we will read that during church as well. Chris, I'm going to hand this to you because I don't want to forget it or be responsible.
Lisa said that's why she leaves the one podium.
You got it. Yep. All right. And if you're curious, my facial hair this morning is not on purpose. I was shaving and then the razor quit. Then I tried to take a manual razor and finish, which I hadn't used in a while, and this is the result. So, hope you're not distracted this morning. It was not intentional. Sorry about that. All right, we're in Romans 13. We're going to finish our paper this week. I've never, ever taken a paper to 3 weeks before, but this just seemed appropriate. This is worth talking about. And I think we're going to be having this conversation for a while, not because we want to, but because we kind of have to. Because not just in our own culture, but around the world, Christians are being compromised and are having to make tough choices in certain situations. And it's best to have the scripture in our minds in advance to understand the difficult parts of it, because I think Romans 13 is a difficult passage. I really do. In fact, I've told you multiple times, Romans and I are not friends in a sense. I really struggle with Romans. It's a tough book, at least for me. And so I hope you can understand that I'm trying to approach it with humility and not ignorance. Well, where we're at is verse 3 of Romans chapter 13. But I think it'd be useful if we just read the whole 7 verses up front so the whole context is in our mind. So if somebody would read Romans 13, starting with verse 1 and go through verse 7, please.
Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. The rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Well, let's look at verse 3 in more detail. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. I can only imagine that when the Romans received this letter and other Christians over time received this letter, they had to look at Romans 13 and be like, Paul, do you remember what government we're in? Do you remember who rules us? I mean, this would be something else if Paul wrote this, I don't know, in the 18th century U.S. That's not what happened. This is first century Rome. This is the same government that would drag Christians in and other disagreeables, according to the Roman government, into the Colosseum and kill them. This was the same government that took Christians and coated them in tar and lit them on fire for candles in Nero's garden. That's where the term Roman candles comes from. And here's Paul saying, for rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. That's tough. Because that's not how it feels sometimes. Certainly not how it looks. I think one thing Paul is doing here, and I struggle with Romans, but one thing I think Paul may be doing here is he's telling us how God intends government to be, not necessarily how it always is. And we know from looking at the examples in the book of Acts, for example, where Paul approaches government, because remember, Paul's under trial for the last half of the book of Acts a lot. You know, he's under Agrippa, and he's under Festus, and he's appealing to Caesar, and there's a lot of legal language there, and there's a lot of testimony going on. In fact, Paul gives the testimony of his own conversion in Acts 22, and that's pretty fascinating. And so we have lots of examples in the book of Acts with Paul. We have examples all throughout the Old and New Testament of how people faithful to God dealt with government. And so I think we have to put all of that in context. That Paul's not saying every government is like this, but rather this is how God intends government to be. Also, I think it's useful, even though it's hard sometimes, because if you study history long enough, you get this feeling of, because I know I've had this feeling before, wouldn't it just be better if we didn't have government at all? Like that's like a temptation that you have, at least it's one I have. But that's not God's plan, never has been. And that's tough when you consider that governments, in a general sense, are responsible for more deaths than just about any other entity in world history. So that's a tough thing. But if God intends government to be this way, and Christians are to be a part of that intention, one thing we could do, potentially, at least this is an understanding I'm trying to get from verse 3 and from commentaries and stuff I've read, is that if we do the right thing, hopefully we can influence government to do the right thing. Doesn't always work. Sometimes you might say it hardly works. But it doesn't change what we're supposed to do. In fact, if there's anything I got from this at all that I'm sure about, is that just because the government acts bad doesn't mean we get to. Really. And I think that's useful to know, because I can't tell you how many times in my life I've heard somebody say, well, the only reason why I did this is because that person did that. And these are adults, not children. You expect children to be petty like that. But I've heard adults say things like that. And that's no excuse. I'm not going to compare your actions, your behavior, in comparison to another. That's not the way this works. I judge things on their own merit. And that's the way I should be treated. And so we're not excused from good behavior just because the government for a time has decided to endorse evil. And we certainly see that. Like, I don't think there's any doubt of that. It's really interesting this week, and I'm not trying to be political, so please understand that. But I was reading an article yesterday from Portland, Oregon, and I have family who live out in Portland, extended family, and kind of get some news from out there. And, you know, the riots, to some degree, have never stopped. That's hard to believe. Like, it's been several months, and most places they fizzled out. Still going on in Portland. Well, the Portland mayor finally issued a statement saying, we got to stop them at any cost. And they're starting to use rubber bullets and tear gas, and they're starting to do whatever they got to do to stop it, because the destruction is just unbelievable at this point. And it turns out you can't placate evil by being nice to it. And so finally, thank God, even the government of Portland, Oregon, much to the relief of my relatives, is starting to understand their role. Because notice what it says here. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good and you will have praise from the same, for it is a servant of God to you for good. You know what? One thing those rioters lacked for a long time was any fear of authority. They didn't think there'd be any consequences for their actions. Especially in the beginning when the DA was just releasing them en masse after causing all kinds of burglary and destruction. Well, now the government's waking up and realizing you can't placate that. You can't be nice to it. It won't stop. In fact, if anything, they've encouraged it. So I guess it gave me a tad bit of hope that maybe even the crazies can wake up. I'm grateful for that. So that seems to me to be the best I can do with this. But I want to open up the floor because I'm 39 and what do I know? So, anybody have any commentary on verse 3? Thoughts, questions, comments? Richard?
The largest Christian nation in the world is not the United States, it's China. Okay? And they have cracked down on the Christians big time in that country. Not just recently, but ever since they started Christian missionaries going, really after the end of World War II. So you can put the shoe on your foot if you're Chinese. Just this morning, I check the news every morning before I leave, whether it's Sunday or whatever day of the week, because I want to make sure Jesus didn't come back in the night and I missed it.
I hate to think that.
That's possible. But anyway, my point is, this morning, the news, I don't know if anybody of you know who Jack Ma is. He's a Chinese billionaire. He recently floated an IPO in China and they shut him down. And he criticized the government. He criticized them for their monetary regulatory. He disappeared yesterday. Nobody knows where he is. This is what the Chinese do. You speak out against him, he disappears. Now here's a man who's a billionaire, got lots of money, and I think he thought, I don't have anything to worry about. I can speak out against this government. And their history is that they stamp out anybody who doesn't agree with them. Now back in the 80s, they took a whole bunch of college students and voted them down. We saw that on TV. And they denied that they did anything wrong. And the whole world didn't do anything. They just said, shame on them. I think personally as a Christian, there comes a time when you have to resist. But you can resist in a nonviolent way. The prayer that Jesus taught us in Matthew chapter 6, verse 13. Deliver us from evil. That's the first place to stop things like this, is to get down on our knees and pray and ask God. And so few people today even know how to pray, or they're afraid to pray. They don't even know who to pray to. So it's for Christians, and that's what I'm addressing in my remarks, is that we need to start praying, not just for our needs, but for this nation, for the world. Because look at what's going on around here. And the Bible said in Revelation and in Matthew, where they asked Jesus directly, tell us when this will happen. And he told them the signs, what to be looking for. So in today's world, making it a practical answer to your question is, I believe we have to resist evil. But it starts by getting down on your knees and praying about it first. And God will give you the wisdom to know what to do and how to do it. That's my thoughts.
Thank you for that. I'm as guilty as anyone that, a good example, I misplaced a silly little belt clip for one of my tools this week, and it was just driving me crazy. Couldn't figure out where it went. Still haven't found it. And I was like 20 minutes into the process where I realized, I've told people that there's nothing too small to pray about. I'll pray about my belt clip. Now, still, God hasn't given it back to me. But maybe it's because I didn't pray first. I don't know. But the point is, how often do we try to solve a problem ourselves before we finally remember that we're supposed to give it to God first? And in the Old Testament, there's a pretty scary story that I have to remind myself of pretty often. I can't remember. Richard, help me out, or anybody else help me out here, because it's just now occurring to me and again. There's a story where I think it's King Saul, I could be wrong, where he sought the doctors first instead of God for his illness. Was that King Saul?
It's not King Saul.
Okay, I'm wrong.
Who's to say what you said again? I didn't catch that.
Okay, I was trying to remember who it was in the Old Testament who sought the doctor's help before the Lord's help, and he died as a result.
Is that Ahaz? Somebody.
Okay, I can't remember.
You're correct. That did happen in one of the Jewish kings.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember what that is, or who that was. And that's a good reminder that we need to seek the Lord first. And I know with a lot of this, government talk and stuff, and you got to be careful about that. But we need to remember to not only pray about the situation, but pray for our enemies. And there's something else about praying for your enemies I've discovered that really helps. It doesn't just help your enemy, it helps you. It lowers the temptation to have a grudge. It lowers the anger. It reminds you of your own faults, that your enemy is not the only one with faults and misunderstandings. And I personally get annoyed when anybody is a total loyalist to any human institution. You meet those people who are totally sold out to one government or another, or one party or another. And I don't have any understanding of that because it's all human, it's all flawed, and it all deserves questioning. It all deserves inquiry and improvement. Got to remember to pray for those that we don't like. And that's hard, but it's necessary. And it's not just for them, it's for us. It's good for me. I've learned that. Any other thoughts on verse 3 before we go on? For it is a servant of God, verse 4, to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Again, this is the ideal government. This is what God would intend government to be. And you might even say that government is at its best when it does this. When it has a policy of being consistent with applying the law. And it's at its worst when it doesn't. And I think we've seen both this past year pretty intensely. And we've seen the results of that. Now, I do like how, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to verse 3 for a second. I do like how he says, do you want to have no fear of authority? He doesn't say, do you want to have no fear of the government? I don't believe in being fearful of the government. But I do believe in having a healthy respect for authority. That's not the same thing. Because like Richard said, if you're a Chinese Christian, you're not in a position where you can always do what they say. You're just not. But there's a proper way to act, and there's an improper way to act when you're resisting. And my best understanding here is whenever possible, we have to obey. And when we can't, we have to be very careful how we disobey or how we resist. And there's two elements to this that I struggle with. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have a conversation with you all. Because the day may come where we deal with this on a congregational level locally. Not yet, but it may happen. And if it does, we not only need to have an understanding, but we need to have a consensus. And that's really hard to do. it's hard enough to get a group, a family, just a local, just your immediate family to agree on something. Sometimes it's hard just between you and your spouse. Then take it to the level of a church, then a community, then a city, then a state, then a country. I mean, every layer, it gets harder and harder to have agreements, to have a consensus as to what you're going to do. And this is what I probably struggle with the most. Because there's so many things about our flesh and the devil and our own inadequacies that contribute to that lack of consensus, the inability to work things out. So if anybody has any ideas on that at all, I'd love to hear them. I know from my experience and what I do now and what I used to do, and that one way you could build consensus is to actually have relationships with people, actually spend time with people, actually talk with people. You do not know somebody if you've never spent time with them. I mean that, like you don't know them. And that's something that when doesn't happen much around here, and I'm very grateful for that. But if somebody does complain about somebody else, almost always this person has never spent any time with that other person. Really. I mean, almost always. It's a secondhand complaint or it's something that's old. I have found that the vast majority of people, if you spend time with them, you get to know them, you do things together, that trust goes a long way to giving the other person grace. And if there's anything you see at a lack of culture today, it's grace. There's just a desire to tear people apart. And sometimes I think the church falls into that worldly idea of no forgiveness, no grace, tear them apart. And we've all seen that. And that's not helpful. In fact, the number of truly awful, evil, terrible people I've met is pretty few. Most people are at least trying to do the right thing. Not everybody, but most people are. Most people have at least a desire not to make other people angry, and yet they do so anyway. Teenagers come to mind. That's one reason why I visit people, and I try to be a very personal preacher, because you don't know me and I don't know you if we don't talk. We got to talk. And I mean, I wish I could talk to everybody every day, because I'm a people person, love to get around. But, the needs of the few outweigh the lesser needs of the many sometimes. But the point is that if we're going to have a consensus, if we're going to survive any persecution that's coming, we need to have grace in mind for one another. Give the benefit of the doubt. Get to know the person. And this is, I think, especially true with first impressions. For example, my wife, and I love my wife. But one way we can disagree sometimes, it's pretty rare because we don't eat out hardly ever, maybe like twice a year. But we can't agree on what restaurant to go to, because if she's had a bad experience at any restaurant ever, she thinks that restaurant is terrible for all existence. She won't give it another shot. It could come under new management. It could have a new name. If it's in the same building, we're not going in there. And maybe I'm exaggerating, but I never do that. But the point is that first impressions can really do a lot with each other, right? Your first conversation you have with somebody doesn't go so well, you immediately start thinking that person is wrong or bad or evil or whatever. And that's not helpful. That's judging a book by its cover. I've met a lot of people who are rough on the outside, but wonderful people on the inside, but you got to get to know them. I can think of one person right now that comes to my head, I'm not going to say names. One person I know right now who just has a rough, gruff, tough, scuff exterior. Just never looks happy, whatever. But boy, he'll do anything for you. And he's done things for people nobody even knows. He's just one of those undercover heroes, and he doesn't want recognition. And if people knew that about him, they wouldn't think of him the same way. In fact, when this guy is, because sometimes he just, if I'm with him or we're doing whatever, he'll just say things that just offend other people. He just has no filter. And I've had to take those people aside and be like, look, that's not what he meant. Really. And this is what this guy did last week for this other person. You may not believe that, but that's what he did. Show him grace. This is just who he is. And I don't think he knows I do that. But that's okay. And I think that one of the reasons why I've learned this is because I've been shown grace so many times. I've said the wrong thing at the wrong time or made somebody mad or didn't do something. One of my problems is I'm forgetful. My wife will tell you this, I don't have a great memory. If I don't write it down, I will forget. And you may think that's ridiculous for a 39-year-old, but it's been true since I can remember writing. It's just who I am. And so if I've been shown grace, I need to show grace to others. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that when the world gets so mean. But don't forget that. God has shown us grace, continues to show us grace. And if we show grace to others, I think the vast majority of the time we'll discover a good person who means well, who can do better, and so can we. I really believe that. And this is not a time to be turned down other Christians. Not now. Not a good time. All right, any thoughts on that? I kind of preached there, sorry. It's a habit. All right, verse 5. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Okay. This verse reminded me of a story from my childhood. You all know this scenario. Everybody in this room has been there. When you go to buy a car from an individual, I can't tell you a time this hasn't happened. They'll say something like, do you want me to write a different number on the sales tax thing so you don't have to pay as much tax? Okay, Rowena's like, yeah, okay, yeah, she's probably seen that. $10,000 car that somebody paid $1,000 for, yeah, right, that kind of thing, right? And I've had this justified to me in a million different ways. But my dad, who I experienced this like 6 or 7 years old, watching my dad buy a car. He'd take us with him so we could learn how miserable it was to buy a car. And to this day, I hate buying cars. But he would always say, no, put the full amount on. I want to have a clean conscience. That's exactly what this means. That's exactly what this means. If we dodge, even if we can, even if it's undetectable, even if nobody catches us, we don't do it for that reason. We do it for conscience sake. That matters. You can tell this is a soapbox for me. But so every time I bought a car, I've told no, put the full amount on there. I want to sleep tonight. I want to have a clean conscience. And for all my errors and mistakes and inadequacies, I have a clean conscience. Not because I always do everything right, but because at least I try. I don't intentionally go out there and try to evade taxes or try to intentionally disobey the government or do what's wrong or offend somebody. I don't do that intentionally. And so for the sake of conscience, we do this. And yeah, it's a pain. None of us like paying taxes. And, if there's a legal way to get around something, okay, fine. But if it's illegal, which it absolutely is illegal to devalue a car when you buy it for the sake of tax purposes, that's wrong. That's just all there is to it. And I've met many a person, Christian people, good people otherwise, who do not obey Romans 13:5. They just can't part with that money. And you know what? I get it. The government wastes money, and you could justify it any way you want. Sometimes they not only waste money, they give it to organizations or things that are terrible and awful. Do you really think the Roman government was any different? Seriously. Has there ever been a government in the history of the world that didn't waste money or send it to people who didn't need it or deserve it? Absolutely. So Paul makes it personal here. This is for the sake of conscience. And also, I don't think anything I'm saying right now will convince you if you feel otherwise, because this is a very personal issue. This is something you have to deal with between you and God. This isn't something I can talk anybody into. All I can do is point out the scripture, and then you got to wrestle with it, and so do I. Because the temptation is there. I was in small business. The temptation to fudge numbers is very high because it's so easy to do. The chances of being audited are low. I mean, I always thought it was interesting that before I used Heather as my CPA, when I tried to do my own taxes in business, TurboTax would actually tell you what you could fudge because the IRS was less likely to audit you for that. It would. It would have a green, yellow, and red system. Don't fudge this because they'll come after you. But you can fudge this, they don't care. Yeah. And I used TurboTax for like 10 years. And what's funny is I never thought about it until recently. It's amazing to me they can get away with that. But it's there. Heather, you have any thoughts on this? No? Okay. Since you're the expert in the room, I just wanted to give you room to talk if you wanted. Okay. Didn't mean to embarrass you.
My theory is unless your CPA is worried about losing the license, you're probably leaving something on the table.
I go to jail, you're coming with me.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. I was listening to a business podcaster the other day because I still have, I don't know, my mind was in that world for so long, I'm still interested in it. And he said, what do you think is the percentage of small businesses who have disobeyed the law? 100%. And he's like, because there's so many laws and there's so many regulations and there's so many ways to do it wrong, it's inevitable. You're going to do it. But there's a massive difference here, sake of conscience, of doing it knowingly and unknowingly. Huge difference. Let me give you another example. And I wish and again, talk a little bit off the cuff here. If a man is on his way to commit adultery but dies in a car accident on the way, is he guilty of adultery? Yes. Why? His intent. To this day, intent matters a lot. Even in our court of law, it matters a lot. Could be the same crime and the same result of that crime, but if the intent was different, it's treated differently. And we all believe that. God does too. That's inherent in our system. So, as much as breaking the law isn't right either way, if we mean to or not, does make a difference. It absolutely does. In fact, there's an old law in the 1970s when CD-ROMs and laser disc and other things like that were first starting to be developed. You're supposed to register every laser device you have with the government. Do you know how many of us have broken that law?
I never heard that.
Right. All of us. Every CD player, DVD player, Blu-ray player, CD drive and a computer, it's all supposed to be registered because the government back then was not aware if lasers were dangerous or not, so they took the cautious side and decided, well, we need to know where all the lasers are. Well, now we know that the vast majority of the time lasers are no big deal, and so nobody bothered to enforce it, and therefore it doesn't matter. So there you go. This is tough, right? That's kind of my point, is you got to wrestle with this stuff. It's not... As a preacher, and I'm sure Richard can relate to this, how many times, Richard, has somebody quoted one verse to you and thought they had you? They'll quote some arbitrary random verse out of nowhere and say, see, I knew it! You're wrong and I'm right! It's like, wow. Wow. You have no idea what you're talking about. That's like quoting one line out of an instruction manual and saying, you understand that part better than this person. That's what that is. Yeah, Richard.
Just to comment on that, we were talking about intent. God's concerned about a sincere heart. He talks about the sincere heart right from the beginning of being born again. That's the difference. Are you sincere? You mentioned intent. We can sometimes intend something and not have a sincere heart, and that's the key. And understanding what the heart is in the Scripture is the key too. It's the will to do something, and it's the mind. So when the Scripture talks about a sincere heart, it's talking about a sincere heart, a mind and a will. You put the two together, and that's what God's interested in. And we all know when we're sincere when we're not. So it's as simple as that, but it's hard to practice.
I think another good way of adding on to that is, and I think if you're in a good marriage, you know this, if your spouse does something wrong, there's a massive difference between they didn't intend to offend you and they intended to offend you. And you know the difference, right? You know when they're being spiteful, and you know when they're just being stupid. In fact, one rule that I've learned is, and this applies to everything: marriage, church, family, community, business, state, country, planet, universe. Assume stupidity before malice. I mean that. When somebody does something dumb, I can't tell how many of us immediately think that person meant to be stupid. But really, I think most people just are. And also, it'll help you have a more graceful view of humanity if when somebody does something dumb, you assume dumb or ignorant versus malice. I've met very few people who really mean to be mean all the time. I meet a lot of people who are dumb by default. Yeah, I've been there. I have, and Alex, I'm sorry to pick on you, I've never met anybody below the age of 25 who wasn't dumb regularly. And the older I get, I see it all the time. And you know why? Because I was that guy. So I've learned to show a lot of grace to young people. I just have. Now, you get to 25, 26, and you're still acting that way. Well, now you're an old infant, and it's time to call you out and shut you down. But before then, I'm going to show you a lot of grace. Because I want you to succeed. I'll fight for you to succeed. And our young people right now growing up in this world, they didn't have the hope we did when we were kids. They don't. What they see is a government out of control, a country out of control, death that's out of control, and nobody seems to know what the answers are. And if that's what you're growing up in, that's a pretty hopeless way to grow up. Now, that doesn't mean we baby our kids. In fact, I have a parenting policy of controlled trauma. I'm going to introduce you to doses of reality so you're ready for it. Like I taught, and this might be controversial, and I'm not trying to be controversial, but I decided I would be the one up front that told my kids what the cuss words were and what they meant. I did that so they wouldn't learn them from their friends and then use them carelessly. If they were going to use them, now I knew they meant to, and they knew what it meant, and I could punish them for it. So I'm the one who taught them. And I did that so that they would know. Because when you know what some of those words mean, you might think twice about using them. That's why they're curse words. That's why they're terrible. And another thing you need to know as a child is that there are real things that are terrible. Cancer is a good example. This COVID thing's a good example. And so I'm not talking about babying anybody, but I am talking about showing a lot of grace because our young people need that chance. There's a point in time where you pull the rug, but up until that point, I'm going to fight for you. And I'm going to stand up for my kids and other kids. Alex, I'm a year away from knowing anything, and you're 2 years away from being an adult, so well. All right. Sorry. All right, okay.
As long as I can.
See, there's humility there. Appreciate that. It's funny. Like you go to the doctor now, and your doctor looks like at least for me, like I'll walk in and I'll be like, "Are you out of high school yet? Like, is this okay?" You know, I'm calling them by an official. You know, I'm calling them by their title, and they're calling me by my first name, and I think, is that supposed to happen when you're 12? Like I don't know. I'm a little weirded out. Or you see a kid driving down the road and you swear you knew he was in kindergarten, but that was 10 years ago, you know? Yeah. So I'm starting to understand that. But don't lose your grace for young people. And if you need to understand that, come to youth group, help you out. It's good for you. You got to be exposed to young people to understand them at all. And by the way, the best thing you can give them is attention because that's a currency we all have, and that currency can pay dividends. And if the kids get the right kind of attention, they'll be motivated to do the right things. But if the only attention they're getting is from negative sources, well, that's what they're going to do. Please those negative sources. All right, sorry, another soapbox of mine. All right. Well, what time we got? Well, we're about out of time. Does anybody else have any thoughts before we close out? Well, that was fast. Good discussion today. Appreciate everybody. Appreciate you being here. I didn't know what kind of crowd we'd have today, but this is relatively normal. So grateful for that. I always don't have enough faith. I always think on these days we're going to have like 20 people in church, and then we have like 100 and something. So God is good. All right. Well, Alex, I think I'll give you the honor of closing us out here.
All right. Thank you. Father, thank you so much for allowing us to be able to be here, to be able to drive safely here, and be able to have people here to be able to study your word and be able to have good discussion. Just be with us throughout worship and be with us also on the way home as well. Love you in Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you all.
Josh, I've got something I'd like to share with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I don't know how any people in here feels about the shot, the virus shot.
Yeah.
Think twice. Cindy gives shots Wednesday or Thursday in the nursing home. And no employees took it, just the senior citizens that were there. They're getting a reaction from it. They're very, very weak, hurting in different ways. One lady complained all day, her eyes were about to chill back. Do what you want. But it's one of those shots that you get free. And Cindy says, if these people don't come out of it, they're not going to get a second or third shot. They're that bad. Reaction from it. Just thought I'd share that with you. Do what you want to. But that's coming out of experience.
All right.
Let's go.
Thank you,
Bye.
Wayne.
Bye.